Welcome to Mr. Crimeshow. In this video, I've gathered 8 chilling true crime cases, each filled with twists and unsettling turns. With rain softly playing in the background and a black screen to set the mood, this compilation is perfect for relaxing, unwinding, or even drifting off to sleep. If you like our work, remember to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from, if you dare. The case of Chad Doerman. On a quiet Thursday afternoon in Monroe Township, Ohio, June 15, 2023, the unthinkable happened in a home that should have been filled with laughter and childhood dreams. 3 young boys, Clayton, 7, Hunter, 4, and Chase, 3, lost their lives due to the actions of the one person who should have protected them above all else, their father, Chad Doerman. What began as an ordinary summer day would end with a community in shock and a family forever changed by an act so devastating that it would leave investigators, neighbors, and millions across the nation searching for answers that may never come. Chad Doerman was 32 years old, a father of 3 boys, and married to Laura Doerman. To those looking from the outside, the family seemed to live a typical life in their converted manufactured home on 3 acres of land that Chad had purchased in 2016 for $75,000. The property was modest but well maintained, and the family appeared financially stable with property taxes paid up to date through 2023. Chad worked a regular job and often posted pictures on social media with his children, including one taken just 4 days before the tragic events unfolded. But beneath the surface of what looked like an ordinary family life, something much darker was brewing. Court records would later reveal that Chad had a history that included some troubling incidents. Years earlier, he had faced a domestic violence charge involving his own father, whom he reportedly choked. That case was ultimately dismissed when his father failed to appear as a prosecution witness. There were also minor traffic violations and a criminal damaging complaint from when Chad was 18, but those too were dismissed. To most who knew the family, these incidents seemed like isolated events from the past, not warning signs of the horror that was to come. Neighbors later described seeing Chad lose his temper with his children on occasion. One neighbor told investigators that he had witnessed Chad toss a couple of them around in the yard one day. Despite these concerning observations, no formal reports of child abuse or neglect had ever been filed with Clermont County Children's Protective Services. When investigators later searched for any history of calls to the Doerman home, they found that police had only been dispatched to the address 3 times since 2020, and one of those calls was on the day of the tragedy itself. On that fateful Thursday afternoon, Chad returned home early from work. According to the detailed bill of particulars filed by prosecutors, what happened next would change everything. After being home for a little while, Chad picked up a Bible and began walking around the house with it. Witnesses would later report that he was heard mumbling the words, "Chad knows what's right." This chilling detail would become one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in understanding his state of mind in those final moments before the unthinkable occurred. Chad then called his 3 sons and wife into the primary bedroom, asking them to join him for a nap. It seemed like an innocent request from a father wanting to spend quiet time with his family. Laura and the boys gathered on the bed, perhaps thinking nothing of this unusual midday family moment. But once they had settled down together, Chad walked to his gun safe in the master bedroom and retrieved a Marlin Model 70 HC.22 rifle. What happened next would be forever seared into the memories of those who survived to tell the story. Without warning, Chad turned the weapon on Hunter, the 4-year-old, taking his young life instantly. Laura immediately began trying to help Hunter while desperately screaming for Clayton and Chase to run. The stepdaughter, Alexis, had been watching television in another room when she heard the first sounds. She rushed toward the bedroom and witnessed the terrifying scene unfolding before her eyes. In that moment of pure panic and adrenaline, she ran after 7-year-old Clayton, shouting for him to keep running and not look back. But Chad was not finished. He chased Clayton into a nearby field, pursuing his own son. When he caught up to the terrified boy, Chad fatally shot him. He then carried Clayton back to the house's yard, placing him down as if laying a child to rest. Meanwhile, Alexis had managed to re-enter the house and grab 3-year-old Chase. She ran toward the road, carrying the youngest boy in her arms, desperately trying to get him to safety. But Chad followed them, raising his rifle and aiming it directly at his stepdaughter. "Put Chase down," he commanded. He pulled the trigger, but the rifle was empty. In that moment, little Chase broke free and ran straight to his mother, Laura, who was now outside in the yard, frantically trying to protect her children. Alexis, realizing this might be her only chance to get help, ran as fast as she could toward the Monroe Township Fire Department. Along the way, she encountered a passerby and managed to tell them what her stepfather was doing before continuing her desperate sprint for help. Behind her, the nightmare was far from over. Chad went back inside the house and carried Hunter's remains outside, laying him in the yard next to Clayton. Laura was now fighting for Chase's life and her own. She tried to wrestle her youngest son away from Chad, but he was determined to complete what he had started. In the struggle, Chad reportedly bit Laura, showing a level of violence that went beyond even the shootings. When Laura managed to grab the rifle, thinking she could protect her last surviving child, Chad fired again, striking her hand and forcing her to drop the weapon. With no one left to protect him, little Chase became Chad's final victim. The 3-year-old's life was ended by the man who had given him life. In total, Chad had fired 9 shots that day. Clayton and Hunter had each been struck multiple times, while Chase was hit once. The field and yard were now silent except for Laura's anguished cries as she desperately tried to revive her 3 boys. Chad then did something that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. He calmly laid Chase next to his brothers and sat on the side stoop of the house. There he remained, watching his wife attempt the impossible task of saving their children until police sirens could be heard approaching at 4:25 p.m. When law enforcement officers arrived at the scene, they immediately instructed Chad to show his hands and walk toward them. But Chad, who had been sitting quietly on the stoop, disobeyed their commands and remained seated. Officers had to approach him directly, taking him into custody at 4:27 p.m. He offered no resistance, no explanation, no emotion. He simply sat there as if nothing had happened, even as the remains of his 3 sons lay in the yard just feet away. The immediate aftermath of the tragedy sent shockwaves through the small community of Monroe Township. This was actually the second incident of its kind in recent months. In February 2023, another local family had been lost to a similar act of violence. The repeated trauma was almost too much for the community to bear. Crisis teams were immediately stationed at Monroe Elementary School to help students, teachers, and families process what had happened. 2 separate GoFundMe campaigns were quickly established to help Alexis and Laura as they faced an uncertain future without the 3 boys who had been the center of their world. As Chad was processed into the system, investigators began piecing together not just what had happened, but why. During police interviews, Chad made a confession that would chill everyone who heard it. He reportedly admitted that he had been planning to end his sons' lives since October 2022. For 8 months, he had been carrying this dark intention, living with his family, going through the motions of daily life, all while planning the unthinkable. The legal proceedings began swiftly. Chad was charged with 9 counts of aggravated murder, 1 for each gunshot that had struck the deceased children. He also received 8 kidnapping charges and 4 felonious assault charges. His first court appearance was on June 16, just 1 day after the tragedy. On June 23, he pleaded not guilty at his arraignment, a plea that would later change as his case progressed through the court system. Prosecutor Mark Tekov initially sought the death penalty, believing that the heinous nature of the crimes and the vulnerability of the victims warranted the ultimate punishment. The case seemed straightforward from a legal standpoint. There were witnesses, physical evidence, and Chad's own confession. But as the months progressed, his defense team began raising questions about his mental state. In March 2024, Chad changed his plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. His attorneys filed motions asking that the death penalty be dropped, citing serious mental illness at time of offense. They argued that Chad was ineligible to receive the death penalty due to his mental condition and requested that an expert's report supporting their claims of mental illness be submitted to the court. This development added a new layer of complexity to a case that had already captured national attention. Around the same time, Judge Richard Ferring made a significant ruling that would impact the prosecution's case. He determined that Chad's Miranda rights had been violated by the officers who interrogated him after his arrest. This meant that the interrogation, including the confession that Chad had reportedly made to investigators, would no longer be admissible as evidence in his trial. The prosecution would have to build their case without what many considered to be their strongest piece of evidence. Chad's trial was originally scheduled to begin in July 2024, but these legal complications caused significant delays. The court needed time to hold pretrial hearings to determine whether Chad was eligible to receive the death penalty, given the mental health claims made by his defense team. As the case dragged on, the community and the surviving family members were left in a painful state of limbo, waiting for some form of justice and closure. But on August 2, 2024, more than a year after that terrible day in June, Chad made a decision that would bring the legal proceedings to an end. He chose to plead guilty to 3 counts of murder in exchange for 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. By accepting this plea agreement, he avoided going to trial and facing the possibility of execution. For the prosecution, it meant guaranteed justice without the risk of a lengthy trial that might end with an acquittal based on mental health defenses. The sentencing hearing was one of the most emotionally charged moments in the entire case. Laura and Alexis stood in the courtroom as an assistant prosecutor read their victim impact statements aloud. These powerful words gave voice to the unimaginable pain and loss that would define the rest of their lives. Alexis, the stepdaughter who had witnessed the horror firsthand and had tried so desperately to save Chase, addressed Chad directly through her statement. "Ever since what you've done, my life has been something I wouldn't wish upon any family," her words rang out in the silent courtroom. She continued with a message that captured both her anguish and her determination to move forward. "Chad, when you go to bed every single night, I want you to know that when you took those 3 boys' lives away, you took mine and you took my mom's." Laura's statement focused on the daily reality of living with such profound loss. "I grieve the loss of Clayton, Hunter, and Chase every single day. I grieve the life they didn't get to live," she said through the prosecutor who read her words. Her statement captured not just the immediate pain of losing her children, but the long-term grief of knowing all the moments, milestones, and memories that would never be. Throughout the reading of these statements, Chad was visibly emotional. He cried and attempted to hold back tears as he heard the impact of his actions described by those who had suffered most. Whether these tears represented genuine remorse, self-pity, or something else entirely, only Chad could know. But for many watching, it was difficult to reconcile the man who appeared broken and tearful with the same person who had systematically ended the lives of 3 innocent children. Judge Ferring accepted the plea agreement and sentenced Chad to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The formal proceedings were over, but for Laura, Alexis, and everyone who had loved Clayton, Hunter, and Chase, the real sentence would last forever. They would spend the rest of their lives learning to live in a world without 3 bright spirits who had brought joy and laughter to everyone around them. The Clayton, Hunter, and Chase Doberman case raises questions that may never have satisfactory answers. Mental health experts have noted that those who engage in such extreme violence often have multiple stressors and a crisis they cannot manage. But millions of people face mental health challenges and crisis situations without harming others, let alone their own children. The planning aspect, revealed through Chad's confession about his months-long intentions, suggests a level of premeditation that goes beyond a momentary break from reality. What remains most heartbreaking is that three young boys, who should have been thinking about summer activities, playing with friends, and enjoying the carefree days of childhood, instead became victims of an act so senseless that it defies understanding. Clayton, with his 7-year-old curiosity and energy. Hunter, just 4 years old and full of the wonder that comes with discovering the world. And Chase, only 3, still in those precious early years when every day brings new words and new adventures. The surviving family members, Laura and Alexis, now carry the unimaginable burden of rebuilding their lives while honoring the memory of the 3 boys they loved so deeply. Their courage in speaking at the sentencing hearing, in sharing their pain with the court and the world, represents a strength that few could comprehend. Their words ensure that Clayton, Hunter, and Chase will be remembered not just as victims, but as the loving, joyful children they were in life. As Chad Doerman begins his life sentence, the 3 little boys he took from this world are remembered by a community that will never forget them, and by a family whose love for them will endure long after the pain of their loss. Clayton, Hunter, and Chase deserved so much more than the few short years they were given, and their memory serves as a reminder of the preciousness and fragility of every child's life. The case of Devon Arthurs. Devon Arthurs was 18 years old when the unthinkable happened on that spring day in May 2017. He had grown up in a household that would later be described as deeply troubled, though the exact details of his family background remained complex and often contradictory in court records. His father, Alan Arthurs, would eventually receive one of the most difficult phone calls any parent could imagine when his son confessed to causing the loss of life of 2 young men. The Arthurs family structure had experienced significant challenges over the years. Devon's upbringing was marked by instability and emotional turmoil that would later become central to understanding the events that unfolded. His parents had separated, and custody arrangements had created additional stress in an already fragile home environment. Those who knew the family described a household where Devon often felt isolated and struggled to find his place among his siblings and extended family members. At 18, Devon was living in apartment 3722 at the Hamptons, a gated community in Tampa, Florida. It was a shared living arrangement with 3 other young men who had become connected through their involvement in a small, mostly online neo-Nazi group called the Atomwaffen Division. His roommates were Jeremy Himmelman, 22 years old, and Andrew Wanchuk, who was just 18. The 4th roommate, Brandon Russell, was the founder of Atomwaffen Division and would later face his own legal consequences for dangerous explosive materials found in the garage. The apartment had become a gathering place for young men who felt disconnected from society and had found a sense of belonging in extremist ideologies. They spent their days immersed in online forums, sharing radical content and planning what they believed would be meaningful acts of resistance. But for Devon, something had begun to change in the months leading up to that fateful May morning. Devon had undergone what he described as a spiritual awakening, converting to Islam and distancing himself from the neo-Nazi beliefs he had previously embraced. This transformation created immediate tension within the household. His roommates, still deeply committed to their extremist views, began to ridicule his new faith openly. They mocked his prayer times, made disparaging comments about Islam, and treated his conversion as a betrayal of everything they had once shared. The morning of May 19, 2017, began like many others in the Tampa apartment. But beneath the surface, Devon was struggling with overwhelming emotions that no teenager should have to face alone. His mental state had been deteriorating for months, though those around him either didn't recognize the signs or didn't know how to respond. He had been experiencing what would later be diagnosed as symptoms of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, including hallucinations and delusions that left him feeling confused and frightened. The argument that morning started over something that might have seemed minor to outsiders, but to Devon, it felt like the final straw. His roommates had once again made comments that he perceived as deeply disrespectful to his Islamic faith. They questioned his sincerity, suggested his conversion was just a phase, and continued the pattern of mockery that had been building for weeks. For someone already struggling with severe mental health challenges, these words carried a weight that was crushing. What happened next would forever change multiple families and shock a community. Devon retrieved a dangerous object and made a decision that he would later struggle to fully explain or understand. Jeremy Himmelman and Andrew Wanchuk lost their lives due to the actions of their former friend and roommate. Investigators later described the incident inside the apartment as a calculated attack. After this, Devon's behavior became even more erratic. He left the apartment and drove to a nearby smoke shop, where he held an employee and 2 customers in a threatening situation for approximately 15 minutes. During this tense standoff, he made statements to those inside that revealed the depth of his mental distress and confusion about his own actions. He spoke about preventing greater violence and claimed that his roommates had been planning terrible acts of terrorism. Tampa police arrived at the smoke shop and began negotiations with Devon. During those crucial minutes, officers worked to de-escalate the situation while trying to understand what had driven this young man to such extreme actions. After 15 minutes of tense dialogue, they successfully persuaded Devon to surrender peacefully. He was taken into custody without further incident, but the investigation into what had happened at the apartment was just beginning. When police searched the apartment, they discovered a troubling collection of evidence. Materials for constructing explosives and extensive neo-Nazi propaganda filled the residence. The materials suggested that the roommates had indeed been planning significant acts of violence, lending some credence to Devon's later claims that he had acted to prevent greater harm. Investigators found detailed plans targeting power lines, nuclear reactors, and synagogues. During his initial interrogation, Devon provided what would become a series of shifting explanations for his actions. To his father, Alan Arthurs, he said he had acted to stop Atomwaffen's plans. To investigators, he repeated similar claims, but also offered an even more complex narrative. He described his conversion to Islam, claimed to support ISIS, and said he had caused the loss of life of Jeremy and Andrew because they had mocked his newfound religion. These contradictory statements would later become crucial in understanding his mental state. In one particularly revealing moment during questioning, Devon told detectives, "The Atomwaffen Division is a terrorist organization. It's a neo-Nazi organization that I was a part of, but the things that they were planning were horrible. They were planning bombings and stuff like that on countless people. They were planning to end civilian life." When asked for specifics, he responded, "Power lines, nuclear reactors, synagogues." He concluded by claiming, "I prevented the loss of life of a lot of people." The legal proceedings that followed would span nearly 6 years, marked by repeated competency evaluations and prolonged stays at the Florida State Hospital. Devon's defense team hired Dr. Valerie McLean, one of Florida's top forensic psychologists, who argued that the young man was not competent to stand trial. She testified about his psychotic symptoms, including his belief that he could see and communicate with those who had passed away. During evaluations, he exhibited self-injurious behaviors, including grabbing himself by the throat in an apparent attempt to stop thinking and feeling. The prosecution, led by Ron Gale, maintained that despite Devon's mental health issues, he was competent to face trial. They argued that his confessions to officers demonstrated his understanding of his actions and their consequences. The case became a complex battle between mental health experts, with multiple evaluations ordered by the court over several years. In 2018, following competency evaluations by 2 court-appointed experts, Devon was initially ruled incompetent to stand trial. He spent more than a year at the Florida State Hospital receiving treatment designed to restore his competency. However, in December 2019, several experts testified that Devon had schizophrenia and bipolar disorder among other conditions, experienced hallucinations, and believed he could communicate with the deceased. Some experts opined that he was incapable of being restored to competency and should remain hospitalized indefinitely. The case took another turn in May 2020, when additional examinations ordered by the judge again deemed him incompetent to stand trial. He was returned to treatment, leaving the families of Jeremy and Andrew in a prolonged state of uncertainty about when, or if, justice would be served. For nearly 3 additional years, the case remained in limbo while Devon continued to receive psychiatric treatment. Finally, in May 2023, after extensive treatment and multiple evaluations, Devon was deemed competent to proceed with trial. The trial was scheduled to begin on May 8, 2023, with jury selection set to commence that morning. His defense team had filed a notice of intent to rely on an insanity plea, citing his diagnosis of schizoaffective and autism spectrum disorders. The document stated that while he knew what he was doing, the defendant did not know it was wrong. However, moments before potential jurors filled the courtroom, Devon's attorney made an unexpected announcement. Instead of proceeding to trial, Devon had decided to accept a plea deal with state prosecutors. The decision came as a surprise to many who had followed the case, as his defense team had spent years preparing for an insanity defense. In the plea agreement, Devon admitted guilt to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 3 counts of kidnapping. In exchange, he agreed to a 45-year prison sentence, which meant he would avoid a potential life sentence that could have resulted from a first-degree murder conviction. State Attorney Susie Lopez stated, "This defendant committed a cold and calculated crime, and for that he will spend the majority of his life in prison." When Devon appeared in court that day, he was described as red-bearded and wearing a red jail uniform. He sat straight-backed as he formally entered his guilty plea before Judge Christopher Nash. The proceeding was attended by family members of both victims, who participated via video conference due to the ongoing impact of the case on their lives. During his allocution, Devon spoke at length about his actions and their consequences. "I feel awful about everything that happened," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 6 years of reflection and treatment. "I want to dedicate the rest of my life to trying to better myself and trying to make the right choices." He described feeling brainwashed by extremist groups and mentioned his experiences with substance misuse as contributing factors to his actions. Devon expressed remorse directly to the families of Jeremy and Andrew. "I feel I can honor the memory of Jeremy and Andrew by being a better human being," he stated. "I've let my family down, I've let myself down, and I've let my country down, and I think about that every single day." He also made a public plea, saying, "I'd like to take this moment to tell the world to stay away from extremist groups." Jeremy Himmelman's sister, Riley Borghetti, was given the opportunity to address Devon directly during the sentencing hearing. Speaking via video conference, she delivered words that captured the lasting impact of his actions on the victims' families. "I don't know you," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've never met you. I hope what you're saying is true. And I also just want you to know that decisions were made that were irreparable for a lot of us for a really long time." She continued, "I don't hate you. I feel sad that your whole life is going to be in prison. I feel sad that there's no alternative that you can go and heal whatever happened to you that brought you to this point." When she asked Devon directly if he thought he belonged in prison, he responded affirmatively, saying, "Yeah, I committed a crime, and I honestly own up to that." Devon went on to describe how he was trying to make the most of his time in prison. "My time that I spend in prison isn't me saying that, oh man, I hate this place," he explained. "I'm going to make the most of my time while I'm here, and I'm going to try to help people. I'm in a dog program, I do horticulture, and I'm going to put to use my time here. I hope I try to do everything I can to facilitate classes and stuff and help people." Prosecutor Ron Gale later explained the decision to accept the plea deal rather than proceed to trial. "It's the families at that point that I need to make sure are adequately represented, and I'm seeking justice for their families," he said. "They really didn't want to go through a trial." He also expressed concern that Devon's mental health might deteriorate again to a degree where he would be found incompetent, potentially derailing the case entirely. Judge Christopher Nash formally sentenced Devon to 45 years in Florida State Prison, followed by 15 years of probation upon release. At 24 years old at the time of sentencing, Devon would be 69 when eligible for release, assuming he serves his full sentence. The judge's remarks emphasized the severity of the crimes while acknowledging the complex mental health issues that had contributed to the tragedy. State Attorney Lopez released a statement following the sentencing. The victims' families are satisfied with this outcome, which allows them to avoid a painful trial, while knowing the defendant will have to dwell upon the pain he has caused for the next several decades behind bars. The statement reflected the mixed emotions surrounding a case that had dragged on for 6 years, causing continued suffering for all involved. The case had broader implications beyond the immediate tragedy, as it shed light on the dangerous influence of online extremist groups on vulnerable young people. Brandon Russell, the founder of Atomwaffen Division and Devon's former roommate, had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for the explosive materials found in their shared residence. The investigation revealed the extent to which the group had been planning large-scale acts of terrorism, validating some of Devon's claims about preventing greater violence. During the years following his arrest, Devon had been arrested again on federal charges for allegedly plotting with a woman in Maryland to launch an attack on an electrical power grid. That case remained ongoing at the time of his guilty plea for the roommate homicides, indicating that his involvement with extremist activities had continued even while facing murder charges. The families of Jeremy Himmelman and Andrew Wanchuk had endured 6 years of legal proceedings, repeated delays, and uncertainty about whether justice would ever be served. Jeremy's sister Riley had become a voice for the family, advocating for accountability while also expressing a remarkable level of compassion toward Devon. Her statement during the sentencing hearing demonstrated both the lasting pain caused by the loss and a desire to see positive change come from the tragedy. The case of Devon Arthurs serves as a tragic reminder of how mental illness, extremist ideology, and online radicalization can combine with devastating consequences. 2 young men, Jeremy Himmelman and Andrew Wanchuk, lost their lives in a moment of violence that forever changed multiple families and communities. Our thoughts remain with their loved ones, who continue to carry the weight of this unimaginable loss, while finding the strength to seek healing and advocate for preventing similar tragedies in the future. The case of Derek Todd Lee. Derek Todd Lee entered this world on November 5, 1968, in the small town of St. Francisville, Louisiana, born into a family already marked by hardship. He was the second of 4 children, raised primarily by his mother, Florence Lee, after his father, a man suffering from mental illness, abandoned them when Derek was just a baby. The man who should have been his protector later ended up in a mental institution after being charged with the attempted harm of his ex-wife. This difficult beginning would cast a long shadow over the boy who would one day terrify an entire region. Florence remarried Coleman Barrow, who took on the responsibility of raising Derek and his siblings. But even within the blended family that now included 13 children and half-siblings, Derek remained isolated and troubled. He struggled in school, placed in special education classes where teachers recognized his limitations, but not the deeper issues. Tests would later reveal his IQ measured between 65 and 75, falling below the threshold that many consider intellectually disabled. Yet behind those numbers lived a mind capable of calculated harm. By age 11, neighbors began noticing troubling behavior. Young Derek was caught peering through windows, watching girls in his neighborhood with an intensity that made people uncomfortable. This pattern would continue throughout his adolescence and into adulthood, earning him a reputation as the local peeping Tom. At 13, he was arrested for burglary, the first of many encounters with law enforcement. When he turned 16, his behavior escalated when he pulled a dangerous object on another boy during a fight, leading to charges of attempted second-degree harm. Despite these red flags and multiple complaints, the system failed to contain him. In 1988, at age 20, Derek met Jacqueline Denise Sims, and they married. For a brief moment, it seemed as though love might change his path. They welcomed 3 children together, Derek Todd Lee Jr., then Doris Lee in 1992, and finally Dedrick Lee in 1999. To the outside world, Lee appeared to be working hard at his construction job and taking his family on weekend outings. But beneath this facade of normalcy, troubling behavior continued to grow. Lee maintained a long-term relationship with another woman, Cassandra Green, whom he sometimes lived with while still married. He would visit local bars, drinking heavily and engaging in affairs that destabilized his relationships. The arguments with Cassandra became increasingly volatile until, in February 2000, she felt compelled to seek a protective order against him. 3 days later, Lee caught up with her in a bar parking lot and subjected her to serious harm. This time, the consequences caught up with him. Cassandra pressed charges, his probation was revoked, and he spent a year in prison until his release in February 2001. But prison had done nothing to change him. When he returned to society in 2001, he was placed under house arrest and required to wear monitoring equipment. Unknown to authorities, this would be the beginning of his most devastating period. The first person many believe lost their life due to Lee's actions was Connie Warner, a 41-year-old woman from Zachary, Louisiana. In August 1992, she went missing from her home, and weeks later, her remains were discovered in a local drainage ditch. Andre Burgos, the former boyfriend of Warner's teenage daughter, reported seeing a man who looked like Lee watching the family's house before Warner disappeared. Though Lee became a suspect, no charges were ever filed. The evidence wasn't strong enough. We believe in our hearts that he ended Connie's life, but we can't prove it, Zachary Police Chief David McDavid would later say with frustration. In April 1998, Randy Mebrower, 28, lived in the same subdivision where Warner had vanished. One spring day, she too disappeared from her home, leaving behind signs of struggle. To this day, Randy's remains have never been recovered, leaving her family without closure and investigators without the final piece of evidence they needed. Missing from both Warner's and Mebrower's homes were the victims' keys, items investigators believed Lee kept as mementos. The harm continued to escalate. In September 2001, Gina Wilson Green, 40, was found in her home near Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, having lost her life due to being subjected to serious harm. Her passing marked the beginning of what would become a reign of fear that gripped southern Louisiana. Months later, in January 2002, 21-year-old Geraldine DeSoto was discovered in her home in Addis, having lost her life due to multiple wounds. Her husband initially became the primary suspect, but DNA evidence would eventually point investigators toward a much darker truth. July 9, 2002, became a date that would change everything. Diane Alexander was alone in her St. Martin Parish home when she heard a knock at her door. A man stood there, claiming to be lost and asking to use her phone. His demeanor seemed harmless enough until he forced his way inside. What happened next was terrifying. Lee subjected Alexander to serious harm, attempting to attack her while choking her with a telephone cord. In her desperate struggle, she managed to place her hand between the cord and her neck, fighting to stay alive. Alexander was slipping in and out of consciousness when Providence intervened. Her son Herman arrived home, his car wheels crunching on the gravel driveway. The sound sent Lee fleeing out the back door, leaving behind evidence of the attack. Herman noticed an unfamiliar gold Mitsubishi Eclipse parked at his parents' home, complete with a Hampton has its license plate and a distinctive dent in the hood. A beige telephone cord hung from the car window. When Herman entered the house, he found his mother on the floor, seriously injured. She was rushed via helicopter to a Lafayette hospital where she would spend 5 days recovering. Diane Alexander's survival would prove to be Lee's downfall. Crime scene personnel secured crucial evidence from the attack, including the severed end of the telephone cord and Alexander's clothing, which contained DNA evidence. More importantly, Alexander could identify her attacker. On May 22, 2003, she worked with a police sketch artist to create a detailed description of the man who had nearly ended her life. Meanwhile, Lee's actions continued. Charlotte Murray Pace, a 22-year-old LSU graduate student, lost her life in May 2002 in one of the most severe attacks. She was subjected to harm with more than 80 wounds in a violent struggle throughout her home. Pam Kinnemore, 44, and Trinacia Denny Colom, 23, would follow, both losing their lives in 2002. Lee's final victim, 26-year-old Carrie Lynn Yoder, lost her life in March 2003. The investigation took a crucial turn when authorities began analyzing DNA evidence from the crime scenes. An FBI profile had initially led investigators to believe they were searching for a white male between 25 and 35 years old. For months, police administered thousands of DNA tests to Caucasian men in the area, following a profile that was tragically incorrect. It wasn't until the now-defunct company DNA Print Genomics analyzed the DNA evidence that the truth emerged. The suspect was primarily of African ancestry. This revelation completely changed the course of the investigation. Between the DNA evidence, a psychological profile, and Alexander's description, police finally had enough to go public with their suspect. Officers in Zachary recognized the sketch from a recent Peeping Tom incident they had investigated. They contacted Baton Rouge police with a name, Derek Todd Lee. Even more importantly, they revealed they had Lee's DNA sample from a prior investigation conducted months earlier. When the lab compared the samples, they found their match. On May 5, 2003, authorities collected a DNA swab from Lee in connection with the Warner and Mebroa cases. Detective Mixon testified that Lee had been caught on multiple occasions watching through windows in the Oak Shadow subdivision where both Warner and Mebroa had lived. When the results came back, they showed Lee's DNA was consistent with evidence from 5 cases: Green, Pace, Kinnemore, Colom, and Yoder. Additional DNA evidence would connect him to the De Soto case as well. When authorities arrived to arrest Lee, they discovered he was gone. His wife had pulled their children out of school within days of his DNA sample being taken, and there was no sign of him at his mother's home or Cassandra Green's apartment. Realizing that few places could hide him once his identity became public, Lee fled first to Chicago, then to Atlanta, where he spent a week at a motel. Following a tip, police arrested him outside a tire shop in southwest Atlanta on May 27, 2003. The legal proceedings that followed would finally deliver justice for Lee's victims. In August 2004, he faced trial for the second-degree ending of Geraldine De Soto's life. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding him guilty, a verdict that carried a mandatory life sentence. Lee showed no emotion as the court official read the verdict aloud, while whispers of relief could be heard throughout the courtroom. In October 2004, Lee faced his second trial, this time for the first-degree ending of Charlotte Murray Pace's life. The prosecution introduced detailed accounts from 4 other cases, painting a picture of a predator who had terrorized Louisiana for years. Diane Alexander's testimony proved crucial, as the only known survivor who could face Lee in court and describe the ordeal she had endured. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA from multiple crime scenes, witness testimony, and a clear pattern of escalating violence. The jury found Lee guilty of first-degree charges. When the penalty phase began, the defense argued that Lee was mentally impaired, pointing to his low IQ scores and troubled background. They painted a picture of a man whose developmental disabilities should spare him from the ultimate punishment. The prosecution countered with the severity of his crimes and the fear he had inflicted on an entire community. On a Thursday evening, the jury took just over 90 minutes to decide Lee's fate. They recommended the death penalty, rejecting defense claims about his mental capacity. As he was being led from the courtroom, Lee held up a V sign and shouted to his family, continuing his suggestions that law enforcement had planted evidence. His mother and sister shouted, "I love you," while the victims' family members gasped, cried, and embraced each other. In December 2004, following the jury's recommendation, a Louisiana state judge sentenced Lee to face the ultimate consequence. He was sent to death row at the maximum security Louisiana State Prison in Angola, where he would spend his remaining years. The Louisiana Supreme Court upheld both his conviction and sentence on January 16, 2008, closing another chapter in this tragic story. Diane Alexander, the brave survivor whose testimony had been instrumental in Lee's conviction, faced one final injustice. She felt she deserved the $100,000 reward offered by Lafayette Crime Stoppers for information leading to Lee's arrest. When she contacted them on August 14, 2003, she was told she was not eligible because she had gone to police rather than using their tip line, and because their offer had allegedly expired. Despite hiring an attorney to pursue the case, the decision was made in Crime Stoppers' favor. Lee would never face the consequence that had been prescribed for him. On January 21, 2016, at the age of 47, he lost his life due to heart disease at a Louisiana hospital. He had been transporting from the state penitentiary for treatment, but his heart finally gave out. The man who had caused so much pain, who had torn families apart and terrorized communities, died in a hospital bed rather than in the execution chamber that had awaited him. The shadow that Derek Todd Lee cast over Louisiana finally lifted with his passing, but the pain he caused continues to echo through the lives of those he touched. 7 women lost their lives due to his actions, their futures stolen, their families left to grapple with loss. Our hearts go out to the families of Connie Warner, Randy Mebrewer, Gina Wilson Green, Geraldine DeSoto, Charlotte Murray Pace, Pam Kinnamore, Trinacia Denny Colom, and Carrie Lynn Yoder, whose memories deserve to be honored not for how they left this world, but for how they lived, loved, and enriched the lives of those around them. The case of Christopher Pittman. Christopher Frank Pittman was born on April 9, 1989, in Huntsville, Alabama, into a family that had already begun to fracture. By the time he was 2 years old, his mother had walked away from their home, leaving Christopher in the care of his father, Joe Pittman, in Oxford, Florida. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his early life. His mother would return, bring hope back into the household, and then disappear again, leaving wounds that never quite healed. Christopher grew up feeling abandoned, carrying the weight of a child who couldn't understand why his mother kept leaving him behind. His father, Joe, tried his best, but their relationship was complicated and sometimes turbulent. Christopher later described his father as harsh, though the details of their troubled dynamic remained largely private. What was clear was that by the time Christopher reached 12, he was struggling deeply with depression, defiance, and a sense of abandonment that colored every aspect of his young life. The boy who should have been playing with friends and focusing on school was instead battling emotions far too heavy for someone his age. In 2001, when Christopher's parents briefly rekindled their relationship, it seemed like a chance for healing. But when his mother left again, the devastation was overwhelming for the 12-year-old. This time, Christopher's pain manifested in the most frightening way possible. He threatened to end his own life. The threat was serious enough that he was hospitalized and confined to a psychiatric facility for troubled children for 6 days. During his stay, doctors diagnosed him with mild chronic depression accompanied by defiant and negative behavior, and they prescribed Paxil, an antidepressant. After about a week, his father made a decision that he hoped would give Christopher stability. Rather than keeping his son in Florida, Joe sent Christopher to live with his paternal grandparents, Joe and Joy Pittman, in Chester, South Carolina. For years, they had been a source of love and consistency in Christopher's chaotic world. When other adults had failed him, his grandparents had been there. It seemed like the perfect solution, a chance for Christopher to find peace in a loving home. When Christopher arrived in Chester in October 2001, his grandparents welcomed him with open arms. Joe Pittman was 66 years old, and his wife Joy was 62. They were patient, caring people who had watched their grandson struggle and were determined to help him heal. However, there was one complication that would prove to have devastating consequences. The local doctor in Chester didn't have samples of Paxil to continue Christopher's medication regimen. Instead, he gave the boy samples of Zoloft, another antidepressant in the same class of drugs known as SSRIs. Although both medications work similarly by affecting serotonin levels in the brain, abruptly switching from one to the other is generally not recommended by medical professionals. Almost immediately, Christopher began experiencing troubling side effects. His older sister, Danielle, who lived nearby, noticed that he seemed different. She described him as manic, exhibiting behavior that was erratic and concerning. Christopher complained of a burning sensation throughout his body that was so severe it required pain medication. When he told his doctor about these uncomfortable side effects, rather than switching him back to Paxil or trying a different approach, the doctor increased his Zoloft dosage from 25 mg daily to 50 mg daily. For the first few weeks, Christopher seemed to be adapting to life with his grandparents despite the medication issues. He enrolled in the local school and tried to settle into a routine. His grandparents, while loving, were also firm about discipline and structure, something Christopher hadn't always experienced. They made it clear that they expected him to behave appropriately and follow their rules. Initially, this seemed to work. But on November 28, 2001, everything changed. That day started with trouble at school when Christopher got into an argument with another student on the school bus. The altercation escalated to the point where Christopher grabbed the younger student around the neck, an act of aggression that was completely out of character for him in the past. When his grandparents learned about the incident, they were deeply concerned and disappointed. That evening, the family attended their local church, where Christopher's behavior continued to deteriorate. During the service, he became fidgety and disruptive, eventually kicking the piano bench while someone was playing. His grandparents were embarrassed and frustrated. They had been trying so hard to help their grandson, and now his behavior seemed to be getting worse rather than better. When they returned home that night, Christopher's grandfather decided that discipline was necessary. He paddled Christopher for his behavior that day and for attempting to leave his room when he had been told to stay put. Christopher was sent to his room, and his grandparents went to bed, hoping that tomorrow would be a better day. But as they slept, Christopher was struggling with thoughts and voices that he would later say he couldn't control. According to Christopher's own later testimony, something was telling him to act, compelling him to do something terrible. He described it as watching a television show or a dream, knowing what was going to happen, but being powerless to stop it. He got up from his bed and went to his grandparents' room. He took their household firearm, an object they had previously shown him how to use during hunting trips, and harmed them while they were asleep. Joe and Joy Pittman lost their lives due to the actions of their beloved grandson, the boy they had tried so desperately to help. Afterward, Christopher's behavior suggested a level of planning and awareness that would later become central to the prosecution's case against him. He set fire to the house using a candle and papers, took his grandparents' car, their firearms, his dog, and $33 in cash, then drove away. The fire spread through the house as smoke detectors rang into the night, a sound that Christopher later said he remembered clearly. Christopher drove for hours, but his flight from the scene came to an end when the car got stuck 2 counties away from Chester. When police found him, he initially told them a fabricated story about a large black man who had kidnapped him after taking the lives of his grandparents and setting fire to their home. He maintained this false account for some time, appearing lucid and coherent during his interviews with officers. Eventually, Christopher's story began to fall apart under questioning. When he finally confessed to what he had done, his words were unsettling, and seemed to show no remorse. He proclaimed that his grandparents deserved what they got. Later, however, he would claim that he had been under the influence of the Zoloft medication and that the drug had caused him to hear voices commanding him to commit the terrible acts. The legal proceedings that followed would drag on for years, becoming a national spectacle that extended far beyond the small town of Chester, South Carolina. Christopher was charged as an adult with 2 counts of taking a life due to his actions, despite being only 12 years old at the time of the events. South Carolina had no minimum age requirement for trying defendants as adults, a legal reality that would become central to the controversy surrounding the case. Christopher's defense team, led by public defenders and later joined by prominent plaintiffs' attorneys specializing in pharmaceutical litigation, built their case around the argument that Zoloft had caused their client to become involuntarily intoxicated. They maintained that the medication had induced a psychotic state that robbed Christopher of his ability to distinguish right from wrong. The defense presented expert testimony suggesting that Christopher had experienced command hallucinations, voices telling him to harm his grandparents, and that he was essentially watching himself commit the acts as if they were happening to someone else. The prosecution, led by Chester County Solicitor John Justice, took a dramatically different view. They argued that Christopher was simply an angry, troubled child who had decided to remove the authority figures in his life. Prosecutor Barney Geese reminded the jury of Christopher's calculated actions afterward, saying, "I don't care how old he is. That is as malicious a process of taking a life due to actions as you are ever going to find." The prosecution pointed to Christopher's planning of the cover-up, his flight from the scene, and his initial false statements to police as evidence that he knew exactly what he was doing and understood the difference between right and wrong. The trial began on Monday, January 31, 2005, nearly 3.5 years after the tragic night in Chester. Christopher was now 15 years old, no longer the small 12-year-old boy who had committed the acts. The courtroom was filled with tension as both sides presented their cases to a jury that would have to grapple with extraordinarily difficult questions about youth, mental illness, medication, and criminal responsibility. Expert witnesses testified about the potential side effects of Zoloft, particularly in children. The defense brought in Dr. Lynette Atkins, a forensic psychiatrist who had examined Christopher and concluded that he had been in a psychotic state induced by the medication when he committed the acts. She testified that the boy had experienced a severe adverse reaction to the drug that had compromised his mental state. The prosecution countered with their own expert, Dr. Pamela Crawford, another forensic psychiatrist who had examined Christopher. Dr. Crawford concluded that Christopher knew what he was doing when he took his grandparents' lives, and that his actions afterward demonstrated clear thinking and self-preservation instincts rather than psychosis. The pharmaceutical company Pfizer, which manufactured Zoloft, became involved in the case, providing information and assistance to the prosecution. This involvement drew criticism from the defense and advocates who argued that it was inappropriate for a drug company to help prosecute a child who claimed their product had caused him to commit violent acts. During the trial, heart-wrenching testimony came from Christopher's own father, Joe Pittman, who found himself in the impossible position of having lost both his parents and facing the potential lifetime imprisonment of his son. Despite the pain of losing his mother and father, Joe Pittman stood by Christopher, testifying that the incidents occurred just 2 days after his son's Zoloft dosage had been doubled. "I love my son with all of my heart, as I did my mom and dad," he told the court. And mom and dad, if they were here today, would be begging for mercy as well. Christopher's sister, Danielle Pittman Fincham, also became a vocal advocate for her brother. She described the dramatic change in Christopher's behavior after he started taking Zoloft, calling him manic and insisting that the medication had caused him to act in ways that were completely out of character. "I think everybody failed him in some way or another," she said during a television interview. "We're going to fight for him. And if I have to keep fighting for the next 29 years to get him out, he's not going to stay in there the full time that he's supposed to. The jury deliberations were difficult and emotionally charged. Jury foreman Arnold Haidt, a university professor, later admitted that Christopher's age made the decision extremely challenging. If Chris Pittman had been 25, we could have come to a decision much earlier. Because of his age, it was very, very difficult, he said. Juror Christine Peterson, who was a grandmother of a 12-year-old herself, described the internal struggle the panel faced. It bothered me a lot, she said. It was not an easy decision, but everyone kept saying, look at the evidence, look at the evidence. I'm sure many of us had sleepless nights. On February 15, 2005, after careful deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on both counts of taking a life due to actions. Christopher was sentenced to 30 years in prison on each count, with the sentences to run concurrently. Circuit Court Judge Danny Pieper gave Christopher the minimum sentence possible under the mandatory sentencing guidelines, acknowledging the unusual circumstances of the case while still holding him accountable for his actions. The conviction was not without controversy. 2 jurors later admitted that they had felt coerced into their decision, and another juror was discovered to have discussed the trial with his wife and bartender during deliberations, potential violations of the court's instructions. These revelations would later become grounds for appeal. When the verdict was announced, Christopher hung his head as the words were read. Before sentencing, he spoke briefly to the judge, saying, "I know it's in the hands of God. Whatever he decides on, that's what it's going to be." His defense attorneys were devastated. "We're heartbroken," said defense attorney Andy Vickery. "We're mystified the state chooses to treat a 12-year-old as an adult." The appeals process began immediately, with Christopher's legal team challenging both the conviction and the decision to try him as an adult. They argued that the state could not constitutionally try someone so young in adult court, and that the sentence constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The South Carolina Supreme Court heard oral arguments on October 5, 2006, and on June 11, 2007, affirmed Christopher's conviction by a vote of 4-1. The case continued to attract national attention, with the Discovery Channel airing a 48 hours episode devoted to Christopher's story. His father continued to advocate for his son, even testifying before the FDA about the dangers of antidepressants in children. On April 14, 2008, the United States Supreme Court declined to hear an appeal based on the Eighth Amendment claim of cruel and unusual punishment. However, Christopher's story was far from over. On July 27, 2010, South Carolina Circuit Court Judge Roger Young granted Christopher's petition for post-conviction relief and ordered a new trial based on a finding of ineffective counsel during his original trial. The judge found that Christopher's original defense team had failed to adequately represent him, particularly in challenging the decision to try him as an adult. Faced with the prospect of a new trial and the passage of nearly a decade since the original crime, the prosecution and defense reached a plea agreement. In December 2010, Christopher pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter rather than murder. He received a 25-year sentence with credit for time already served. The plea agreement acknowledged that while Christopher had committed the acts that resulted in his grandparents' deaths, there were mitigating circumstances related to his age and mental state at the time. Christopher was incarcerated at the Allendale Correctional Institution with a projected release date of February 22, 2023. During his years in prison, he matured from a troubled child into a young adult, participating in educational programs and reportedly showing genuine remorse for his actions. On February 22, 2023, he was released after serving over 2 decades in prison, though he remained under state supervision for an additional 2 years. The Christopher Pittman case remains one of the most troubling and complex criminal cases involving a child defendant in modern American legal history. It raised fundamental questions about how society should handle young people who commit serious crimes, the role of psychiatric medications in criminal behavior, and the appropriability of trying children as adults. While Christopher has now been released and attempts to rebuild his life, the memory of Joe and Joy Pittman, two loving grandparents who lost their lives due to the actions of the grandson they tried so desperately to help, serves as a permanent reminder of a family tragedy that touched an entire nation. The case of Cassidy Rainwater. Cassidy Marie Rainwater was born on June 9, 1988, in the small town of Lebanon, Missouri, to parents Clifford Welch and Tracy Wawashuk. She was described by her family as a woman with an incredibly outgoing personality who could light up any room she entered. Cassidy loved spending her days by the river searching for arrowheads, a passion she shared with her mother, and she found solace in writing poetry and singing. Those who knew her best said she was simply a fun person to be around, someone who brought joy wherever she went. But Cassidy's life was marked by challenges from an early age. Growing up in Lebanon, a town of about 15,000 residents where nearly 22% of children lived below the poverty line, opportunities were limited. When she was just 18 years old, she attended Harrison Hill High School and became a mother to a baby boy with a man named Ben. The relationship didn't last, and Cassidy was forced to take Ben to court for child support in June 2006, where he was ordered to pay $224 per month. Eventually, the difficult decision was made to place the baby for adoption. Later in life, Cassidy married Zachary Paul and went on to have 6 more children. Though she was still married to Zachary at the time of her passing, their relationship appeared unstable, as she was not living with him during the final months of her life. For someone who loved family gatherings and making connections with people, this separation from her children and husband left Cassidy searching for stability and a place to call home. The town of Lebanon itself struggled with crime, ranking safer than only 10% of U.S. cities, with a crime rate of 31 per 1,000 residents. This environment of poverty and crime seemed to follow the women in Cassidy's family. In April 2007, when Cassidy was just 19 years old, her mother Tracy went missing while supposedly looking for arrowheads. Tracy's boyfriend Leonard reported her disappearance, but it wasn't until May 8, 2008, that her remains were discovered in a field near Lebanon. Tragically, no one was ever arrested for Tracy's passing, and the cause remained a mystery that would haunt the family for years to come. By the summer of 2021, Cassidy found herself in a particularly vulnerable position. Often experiencing homelessness, she was staying temporarily with a 58-year-old man named James David Phelps at his property on Moon Valley Road near Windyville, Missouri. She had told friends and family that she just wanted to stay there long enough to get back on her feet and start fresh. James, who went by Jim, seemed like a kind enough person at first glance. He had grown up in Preston, Missouri, made the honor roll at Skyline High School, and served in the United States Army after graduation. In February 2019, he had even become an ordained minister with the Universal Life Church. But behind this facade of respectability, something much darker was lurking. On July 25, 2021, Cassidy was last seen alive at James's property. She had been staying there for what she hoped would be just a short period while she worked to rebuild her life. But as days turned into weeks without any contact from Cassidy, her family grew increasingly concerned. It simply wasn't like her to disappear without staying in touch, especially with her children and the aunt who cared for one of them. On August 25, 2021, exactly 1 month after anyone had heard from Cassidy, her Aunt Cora made the decision that would begin unraveling the truth. Cora had been serving as guardian to one of Cassidy's children and knew better than anyone that her niece would never voluntarily stay out of contact for so long. She called the authorities to report Cassidy missing, explaining that the last time she had seen her niece, Cassidy was with a man named Jim who drove a silver GMC truck and owned a cabin near Windyville. When authorities arrived at James's property to conduct a wellness check, they found him cooperative but his story suspicious. James claimed that Cassidy had left his property in the middle of the night on July 25th, getting into a vehicle that had been parked at the end of his driveway. According to his version of events, she had simply driven away to Colorado, and he hadn't seen or heard from her since. The story seemed plausible enough at first, given Cassidy's transient lifestyle, but investigators made note of the details for future reference. For weeks, the case remained at a standstill, with no new leads or evidence to suggest what had really happened to Cassidy. But on September 16, 2021, everything changed when the Dallas County Sheriff's Office received a phone call that would crack the case wide open. An FBI agent from Kansas City contacted them about an anonymous tip that had been submitted through an online form. Someone had sent a series of photographs showing a woman who appeared confined in a cage. The images were reportedly circulating on the dark web, that hidden part of the internet where disturbing content often finds its way. When investigators examined the photographs, they immediately recognized the woman as Cassidy Rainwater. The images made her instantly recognizable, suggesting that whoever took these photos had placed her in deeply unsafe conditions. But even more concerning were additional photos that showed Cassidy's remains connected to a gantry crane, the type commonly used for processing deer. The anonymous tipster had essentially provided law enforcement with a visual record of what had happened to the missing woman. Armed with this evidence, police returned to James's property and immediately placed him under arrest. This time, they weren't there for a wellness check, but to execute a search warrant and begin processing what they now knew was a crime scene. The Dallas County Sheriff's Office was careful to limit the information they released to the public, stating only that, due to the extreme nature of the crime and the continuation of the investigation, additional details cannot be released at this time. As investigators began searching the property more thoroughly, they discovered that James had not been acting alone. Living at the same Moon Valley Road address was a man named Timothy Leroy Norton. Born in 1965 in Cromwell, Minnesota, Timothy had attended Hermitage School, where he made the honor roll before joining the United States Marine Corps and becoming a helicopter pilot. But by the early 1990s, Timothy had developed a criminal history that included writing bad checks and failing to pay rent, leading to lawsuits from landlords. On September 19, 2021, police brought Timothy in for questioning about Cassidy's disappearance. During the initial interview, investigators noticed inconsistencies in his story about the events of July 25th. The following day, they called him back for a second interview, and this time the pressure proved too much. Timothy broke down and admitted to investigators that he had helped restrain Cassidy sometime in July. According to court documents, he confessed that he physically confined Cassidy Rainwater by holding her down for a substantial period of time for the purpose of facilitating the commission of a felony or inflicting harm or terrorizing her. On September 21, Timothy was booked into the Dallas County Jail without bond. Now investigators had both men in custody, but they still needed to piece together exactly what had happened and find physical evidence to support the emerging story. For the next 7 days, investigators processed the entire crime scene around the clock. They found the actual cage that had been shown in the photographs, along with the gantry crane device. Investigators also discovered packages in a freezer labeled with the date, July 24. Additional remains believed to be Cassidy's were located on adjacent property that belonged to her grandfather, Bill Rainwater. Digital evidence recovered from electronic devices revealed messages between James Phelps and Timothy Norton that showed they had been planning Cassidy's fate. In total, investigators collected over 200 pieces of evidence from the scene. The scope and organization of the evidence suggested this had not been spontaneous, but something carefully planned. On September 20, 2021, FBI agents conducted a detailed interview with Timothy Norton that would provide the most complete picture of what had happened to Cassidy. According to his statement, James had called him over to the property while Cassidy was sleeping on the living room floor, making her vulnerable. Timothy stated that after he entered the house, he held Cassidy's legs down while James restrained her further. After Cassidy had lost her life due to their actions, Timothy said he and James took a brief break before carrying her remains outside. According to Timothy's account, James then placed Cassidy on the gantry crane and carried out actions that further harmed her remains. Timothy admitted that he helped James carry her remains into the house afterward. The methodical nature of these actions suggested that both men knew exactly what they were doing and had possibly planned these steps in advance. But perhaps most chilling of all was Timothy's additional confession that he and James had been actively searching for other potential victims. They had been looking online and even scouting at a nearby Walmart for women who might be vulnerable like Cassidy. This revelation suggested that Cassidy might not have been their first target, or certainly wouldn't have been their last if they hadn't been caught. Sheriff Scott Rice later revealed that the two men had known each other for a very long time. From what I understand, they were classmates in school. Over the years, they've stayed friends since high school, he explained. This long-standing friendship had apparently developed into something much darker over the years, with both men feeding off each other's tendencies. When the men were arrested, Sheriff Rice noted that they didn't seem surprised. Norton did talk about it. They didn't seem shocked, he said. This reaction suggested that they had been expecting to be caught eventually, or perhaps that they had been living with the knowledge of what they had done for months. On October 4, 2021, just as investigators were building their case, James's Moon Valley Road property mysteriously burned to the ground in the middle of the night. When a Dallas County deputy arrived at the scene, he discovered a tripwire near the home, prompting officials to call in a bomb squad. Several hours later, they safely detonated a suspicious incendiary device that had been placed in a mortar tube with a balloon cover and tripwires. The Missouri State Fire Marshal's office later determined that the fire was the result of arson and ruled it as both undetermined and criminal. James and Timothy appeared in court via video on October 5, both facing kidnapping charges and represented by different public defenders. The prosecution requested 45 days to prepare for the preliminary hearing due to the large number of witnesses they needed to organize. The defense opposed this timeline, citing Missouri Supreme Court requirements for a 30-day period, but eventually Dallas County prosecutor Jonathan Barker was granted the time he needed. As news of the case spread through social media and various online platforms, Sheriff Scott Rice felt compelled to address the public directly through a Facebook post on October 7. He expressed frustration with the misinformation being spread online, particularly criticizing crime reporters, bloggers, and TikTok users who were sitting in their apartment or their mommy and daddy's basement, eating great value cheese puffs and drinking box wine with grand intentions of being a social media superstar. He emphasized that 99.99% of what had been posted to social media was crap, and reminded the public that real investigations take time and must follow proper legal procedures. On November 17, 2021, after DNA tests confirmed that Cassidy had lost her life, the Dallas County prosecutor upgraded the charges against both James and Timothy. In addition to kidnapping, they now faced first-degree murder and abandonment of remains charges. These upgraded charges were based on the overwhelming physical and digital evidence that investigators had collected over the previous 2 months. When James appeared in court on November 19, 2 days after the charges were amended, he was denied bond. In the coming weeks, both men pleaded not guilty to all charges, setting the stage for what promised to be lengthy and complex legal proceedings. The legal process stretched out over more than a year, with multiple delays and procedural motions. In September 2022, prosecutors filed their intent to seek the death penalty against James, while his attorney requested a change of venue for the trial. Court documents filed in Timothy's case revealed an additional disturbing element. Authorities had found inappropriate digital material in his home. In April 2023, James made the decision to enter an all-forward plea, which allowed him to accept a guilty verdict without admitting guilt or going through a criminal trial. Under this arrangement, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This plea meant that many of the most disturbing details of the case would never be fully aired in a public courtroom, sparing Cassidy's family from having to relive the trauma through testimony. Timothy appeared in court on June 27, 2023, where he chose to plead guilty to one count of first-degree murder in Cassidy's case. In exchange for his guilty plea, prosecutors agreed to drop the felony charges of kidnapping and abandonment of remains. Like James, Timothy was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he stood before the judge to receive his sentence, Timothy reportedly said, "I deserve to die, and I am ready for that." In January 2024, a wrongful death lawsuit resulted in a $30 million default judgment awarded to Cassidy's children. The lawsuit, filed by Donlan Law, detailed how Cassidy Rainwater suffered extreme physical injuries and emotional distress between the time of the initial harm at the hands of defendant Norton and until the time of her eventual passing. Since neither James nor Timothy responded to the lawsuit, they effectively waived their right to a jury trial. While it's unlikely that Cassidy's children will ever see anywhere near $30 million, since neither man has significant assets, the judgment serves an important symbolic purpose. Under Missouri law, any future assets the men might acquire while in prison will be garnished, and the judgment is also a requirement for applying for compensation from a tort victim fund that caps at $300,000. Ben, the father of one of Cassidy's children, spoke to the media about the loss and his concerns for Cassidy in her final months. "I always worried about her just because of her past," he said. "She was in a bad way. She and I talked and I was like, come to Kansas City. We'll get things figured out." She was hoping to get her life back together. His words painted a picture of a woman who was struggling but still fighting to rebuild her life and reconnect with her children. 3 years after her tragic end, on August 16, 2024, Cassidy's family was finally able to hold a memorial service to properly honor her memory. The delay spoke to the prolonged trauma that her loved ones endured, not only from losing Cassidy, but from the lengthy legal process that followed. The case of Cassidy Rainwater serves as a heartbreaking reminder of how vulnerable people can become targets for those with evil intentions. She was a mother, a daughter, and someone trying to get her life back on track when she encountered two men who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity. Her story resonates not just because of the tragic nature of her final days, but because she represents so many people who are struggling to survive and rebuild their lives in small towns across America. Our hearts go out to Cassidy's children, her family, and all those who loved her and will carry her memory forward. The case of Zeb Quinn. The winter evening of January 2, 2000, started out like so many others for 18-year-old Zeb Wayne Quinn. He had just finished his shift at the electronics department of the Walmart on Hendersonville Road in Asheville, North Carolina, a job he genuinely enjoyed. Zeb was well liked by his co-workers and customers alike, known for his friendly demeanor and helpful nature. Born on May 12, 1981, he was an ambitious young man with plans for his future, enrolled in an ROTC program and saving money to buy his own car. That Sunday night, he was finally going to take a step toward that goal by looking at a vehicle in nearby Leicester with his co-worker and friend, Robert Jason Owens. Zeb came from a close-knit family that adored him. His mother, Denise Vlahakis, worked as a neonatal nurse at Mission St. Joseph's Hospital alongside Zeb's grandmother and sister. The family was tight-knit, and Zeb was known as someone who wasn't afraid to show affection, even hugging his mother in front of his classmates without caring what they thought. His father was also very much in his life, and they would often spend time together playing pool at a local spot called Q and Spirits on Hendersonville Road, not far from where Zeb worked. The Quinn family felt secure in their relationships with each other, never imagining that one ordinary Sunday would shatter their world forever. Around 2100 that evening, Zeb met Robert Jason Owens in the Walmart parking lot. The two had arranged to drive separately to look at a car that Zeb was interested in purchasing. Surveillance footage from a nearby CITGO convenience store captured them both around 21:15, purchasing sodas before they continued their journey. The video showed Owens' Ford pickup truck pulling away first, with Zeb's light blue Mazda protege following behind, headed toward Long Shoals Road. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Zeb Quinn while he was alive. What happened next would become the subject of intense scrutiny and debate for over 2 decades. According to Owens' account to police, after leaving the gas station, Zeb flashed his headlights, signaling for Owens to pull over near T.C. Robertson High School on Long Shoals Road. Owens claimed that Zeb had received a page and needed to find a payphone to return the call, as cell phones weren't yet commonplace. When Zeb returned from making the call about 10 minutes later, Owens said he appeared frantic. According to Owens, Zeb cancelled their plans and was in such a rush to leave that he rear-ended Owens' vehicle before apologizing and driving away. Owens insisted this was the last time he saw his co-worker and friend. The story took an even stranger turn in the early morning hours of January 3rd. Owens appeared at a local hospital with injuries to his head and a broken rib, claiming he had sustained them in a second car crash near the Waffle House restaurant on Long Shoals Road, close to the Interstate 26 intersection. However, no accident report was ever filed with police regarding this alleged second collision. The timing and circumstances of Owens' injuries would later raise significant questions among investigators. 2 days after Zeb's disappearance, on January 4th, a man claiming to be Zeb called the Walmart to report that he was sick and wouldn't be able to work his scheduled shift. However, the co-worker who took the call immediately recognized that the voice didn't sound like Zeb at all. When authorities traced the call, they discovered it had been made from the Volvo plant where Robert Jason Owens worked. When confronted about this, Owens admitted to making the call, but claimed that Zeb had asked him to do so as a favor. This explanation struck many as suspicious, particularly given that Zeb had supposedly driven away from their last encounter in a state of urgency. That same afternoon, Zeb's mother Denise filed a missing person report. The family was deeply concerned, as it was completely out of character for Zeb to disappear without explanation or contact. As the investigation began, police discovered troubling details about the page that had allegedly caused Zeb to act so frantically that night. Phone records revealed that the page had been sent from the home of Zeb's paternal aunt, Inez Ustich. This was particularly puzzling, because Zeb had very little contact with this aunt prior to his disappearance. When police questioned Ustich about the page, she firmly denied making the call. She told investigators that she had been having dinner at the home of her friend Tamra Taylor that evening, and that Misty Taylor and Wesley Smith were also present. Misty Taylor was a young woman in whom Zeb had developed a romantic interest in the weeks before his disappearance. According to friends and family, Zeb had confided that he felt threatened by Misty's boyfriend, Wesley Smith, who had become aware of Zeb's interest in his girlfriend. The connection between all these individuals on the very evening of Zeb's disappearance seemed too coincidental to ignore. Adding another layer of mystery to the case, Ustich later filed a police report claiming that her house had been broken into that same evening. However, she reported that nothing had been stolen. Instead, a few picture frames and other items had simply been moved around. The break-in seemed designed to create confusion rather than to take anything of value, leading investigators to wonder if someone had used her home to send that crucial page to Zeb. For 2 weeks, there was no sign of Zeb or his vehicle. Then, on January 16, 2000, his light blue Mazda protege was discovered in the parking lot of Little Pig's Barbecue on McDowell Street. The location was particularly significant because the restaurant was adjacent to Mission St. Joseph's Hospital, where Zeb's mother, grandmother, and sister all worked as nurses. The circumstances surrounding the car's discovery were deeply unsettling and seemed designed to send a message. Inside the vehicle, investigators found several unusual clues. The car's headlights had been left on, draining the battery. A live black Labrador mixed puppy was found inside the car, though it didn't belong to Zeb. On the back windshield, someone had drawn a pair of lips and 2 exclamation marks in pink lipstick. The driver's seat had been adjusted for someone much shorter than Zeb. Also found in the car were several empty drink bottles, a jacket that didn't belong to Zeb, and a plastic hotel key card that investigators were never able to trace to any specific hotel. The puppy was eventually adopted by one of the investigating officers. Police collected forensic evidence from the car, but were unable to develop any new leads from their findings. Zeb's mother, Denise, believed that whoever left the car there knew about her family's connection to the nearby hospital and intended for one of them to find it. This theory suggested that Zeb's disappearance was not random, but rather a calculated act by someone familiar with his family's routines. A couple later came forward to report that they had seen Zeb's car being driven in downtown Asheville after his disappearance. They worked with police to create a composite sketch of the person they had seen driving the vehicle. Investigators noted that the sketch bore a striking resemblance to Misty Taylor, the young woman at the center of the alleged love triangle that friends and family said had been troubling Zeb in the weeks before he vanished. Despite extensive investigation, the case eventually went cold. Zeb's family never stopped searching for answers, never stopped hoping that someday they would learn what happened to their beloved son and brother. The years passed with no significant developments, and it seemed as though the mystery of Zeb Quinn might never be solved. His mother continued to grieve, wondering every day what had become of the boy who had brought so much joy to their family. Then, 15 years after Zeb's disappearance, a shocking development breathed new life into the cold case. On March 17, 2015, Robert Jason Owens was arrested in connection with the loss of life of Food Network star contestant Christy Scone Codd, her husband J.T. Codd, and their unborn child. The Codds had been Owens' neighbors and friends, making the case all the more shocking. Owens later admitted to authorities that he had accidentally run over the couple with his truck when it became stuck in mud near their home. Rather than report the accident, Owens panicked and made the disturbing decision to conceal what had happened. Investigators later discovered that Owens attempted to cover up the incident by disposing of the Codds' remains in a destructive manner. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community and immediately refocused attention on the unsolved case of Zeb Quinn. Investigators began to see troubling parallels between the two cases. Like Zeb, the Codds had been friends with Owens. Like Zeb, they had trusted him. And like Zeb's case, Owens' explanations didn't always add up under scrutiny. During the investigation of the Codd case, a relative of Owens came forward with information that proved crucial to the Quinn investigation. This unnamed relative told police that both before and after January 2000, Owens had dug a pit on his property at Owens Cove Road to burn items. The relative also revealed that sometime after January 2000, Owens had poured concrete over the area, claiming he was going to make a fish pond. However, the pond was never completed, and Owens later covered the area with dirt. This information led to a search warrant being issued for Owens' property on March 31, 2015. The search of Owens' property yielded troubling results. Investigators found fabric, leather materials, and unknown hard fragments buried under the layer of concrete. They also discovered an unknown white powder substance, pieces of metal and concrete, and numerous plastic bags containing what appeared to be pulverized lime or powdered mortar mix. While authorities never confirmed whether these fragments were human remains or specifically connected to Zeb Quinn, the discoveries were deeply concerning and suggested that Owens had been disposing of evidence on his property for years. On April 27, 2017, as part of a plea deal negotiated by his attorneys with Buncombe County District Attorney Todd Williams, Owens was sentenced to serve between 60 and 75 years in prison without the possibility of parole for the Cod case. The plea deal had allowed him to avoid the death penalty, but it also meant he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Just months later, on July 10, 2017, a Buncombe County grand jury returned an indictment charging Robert Jason Owens with first-degree punishment in the death of Zeb Wayne Quinn. The indictment came 2 days after Owens' uncle, Walter Gene Owens, had passed away. District Attorney Todd Williams announced that his office would not seek the death penalty against Owens in the Quinn case. According to the Asheville Police Department, the indictment was the result of years of investigative work and persistence by detectives of the Asheville Police Department, as well as ongoing partnerships with members of the Quinn family and the Buncombe County District Attorney's Office. The trial was delayed several times due to personnel changes and COVID-19 concerns that had suspended jury trials. For years, Zeb's family waited for their day in court, hoping that a trial would finally provide the answers they had been seeking for over 2 decades. However, the case would ultimately be resolved not through a trial, but through another plea deal that left many questions unanswered. In July 2022, it was revealed that Owens had told investigators back in 2018 that a family member had been responsible for Quinn's passing, and that evidence could be found in Bent Creek Experimental Forest. This new information led to additional searches, but investigators failed to find remains or other evidence corroborating Owens' statements. On July 25, 2022, over 22 years after Zeb Quinn's disappearance, Robert Jason Owens appeared in Buncombe County Superior Court to enter a plea. However, instead of pleading guilty to first-degree punishment as originally charged, Owens pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of accessory after the fact to first-degree punishment. Through his attorneys, Owens presented a new version of events that many found difficult to believe. According to Owens' courtroom statement, his uncle Walter Gene Owens had been the actual person who caused the loss of Zeb Quinn's life. Robert claimed that Zeb had been caught up in a love triangle involving Misty Taylor and her boyfriend Wesley Smith, and that Smith had hired Gene Owens to eliminate his perceived romantic rival. Robert's story suggested that both he and Zeb had been unknowingly lured by Gene to meet Misty Taylor in Pisgah National Forest, where they found Gene waiting instead. According to this account, Gene harmed Zeb with a dangerous object, then disposed of his remains in a destructive manner. Robert claimed that he had only helped his uncle cover up the act afterward. The prosecution expressed skepticism about Owens' account. District Attorney Todd Williams and his team didn't believe Owens' story, but they acknowledged that proving Robert Jason Owens had directly caused Zeb's death would be difficult given the lack of strong physical evidence. The court accepted the plea deal, and Owens was sentenced to 12.5 to 15 3/4 years in prison for his role as an accessory. This sentence would run concurrently with his existing life sentence for the Cod case, meaning it would not add additional time to his incarceration. The plea deal provided legal closure to the case, officially establishing that Zeb Quinn had been the victim of a crime. However, many observers, including some investigators and members of the community, felt that justice had not been fully served. Amy Carson, a former friend and neighbor of Owens, expressed her doubts about his latest story, calling him a pathological liar and questioning his decision to blame someone who could no longer defend himself. She found it convenient that Owens was accusing his uncle, who had passed away in 2017, and could not contradict his account. District Attorney Todd Williams addressed these concerns in a statement following the plea hearing. He acknowledged that the full truth about Zeb Quinn's fate might never be known, but emphasized that the plea deal was supported by evidence going back to the weeks following Zeb's disappearance. Williams noted that the agreement had been discussed extensively with Zeb's mother, Denise Vlahakis, and his sister, Brandy Quinn, and that both had approved the resolution in advance. The district attorney expressed hope that those wishing to sensationalize the case would respect the family's desire for peace and privacy. For the Quinn family, the plea deal represented both closure and frustration. After more than 2 decades of uncertainty, they finally had legal confirmation that their beloved Zeb had lost his life due to the actions of those who should have been his friends. However, the circumstances of his passing remained largely unknown, and the person most responsible for his death might never face appropriate consequences. Denise Vlahakis, who had spent over 20 years wondering what happened to her son, now had to accept that some questions might never be fully answered. The case of Zeb Quinn serves as a heartbreaking reminder of how a single evening can forever change the lives of those left behind. A young man full of promise and love for his family, Zeb Quinn would have been 41 years old at the time of Owen's plea deal. Instead, his life was cut short by individuals he trusted, leaving his family to grieve not only his loss, but also the many years of uncertainty that followed. Though legal resolution has been reached, the pain of his absence continues to echo through the hearts of all who knew and loved him. The case of Claire Tiltman. Claire Tiltman was 16 years old when she lost her life on a cold January evening in 1993, just 4 days after celebrating her birthday. She was the only child of Linda and Cliff Tiltman, who had raised her with love in the quiet Horns Cross area of Stone, near Greenhithe in Dartford, Kent. Her parents cherished their bright, ambitious daughter, who attended Dartford Grammar School for Girls, where her friends affectionately called her Tilts. She was someone who drew people to her naturally, with what the judge would later describe as an engaging and lively personality that made her extremely popular with a wide circle of friends. Claire had just completed her mock GCSE exams and was in year 11, regularly discussing college plans and her future with classmates. She was deeply involved in the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, working toward her bronze award through activities at the local Dartford fire station. Her dream was to become a firefighter, a goal that reflected her caring nature and desire to help others. Her school friends remembered her as beautiful and loyal, with a wicked sense of humor, someone who was funny and ambitious, and brought light to every room she entered. These were the qualities that made Claire special to everyone who knew her, from her devoted parents to the many friends who would later form the Justice for Claire campaign to keep her memory alive. The Tiltman family belonged to the local British Legion Club, a community gathering place where they had built friendships over the years. It was through this connection that they knew another family, the Ashsmiths, who also attended club events regularly. Colin Ashsmith was 8 years older than Claire, 24 at the time, and lived with his parents on Milton Street in nearby Swanscombe. He occasionally played pool with Claire during family visits to the club, creating what seemed like a harmless acquaintance between their families. No one could have imagined that this familiar face would later be linked to such devastating events. On the evening of January 18, 1993, Claire left her family home to visit a friend, taking what should have been a simple, safe walk through her neighborhood. It was just after 6:20 p.m. when she entered a dark alleyway that served as a shortcut off the A226 London Road, close to her home in Greenhithe. This pathway was one she had used many times before, a routine part of moving through her familiar community. But on this night, someone was waiting in the shadows, someone who had been planning something harmful. What happened next changed everything for the Tiltman family and the entire Dartford community. Claire was subjected to a violent attack, harmed repeatedly by someone who struck from behind. Passers-by discovered her shortly after the incident began and immediately tried to help, but despite their efforts and the quick arrival of emergency services, Claire did not survive. She had been targeted in what prosecutors would later describe as a savage and brutal act of violence by someone who took pleasure in causing harm. The investigation that followed was exhaustive, involving hundreds of officers and thousands of tips from the public. Claire's photograph appeared on front pages across the nation as police appealed for any information that might lead to her attacker. Her parents, Linda and Cliff, kept the case in the public eye for years, never giving up hope that justice would eventually come. They attended press conferences, spoke to reporters, and maintained their belief that someone in their community knew who had taken their daughter's life. The pain in their voices was evident when they spoke at Claire's funeral, with Linda saying, "You look around and you hope that it's someone you don't know, but we don't know. That person could have been there. I hope that they weren't. I'll never ever forgive that person for whatever reason. That person's got to be caught." Despite the intensive initial investigation, the case went cold for nearly 2 decades. Colin Ash Smith attended Claire's funeral, standing among the mourners as her family and friends said their final goodbyes. He continued living in the same area, working as a milkman, while carrying the secret of what he had done. But his violent tendencies didn't end with Claire's loss. In 1995, just 2 years later, he attacked another young woman, Charlotte Barnard, in the same area of Greenhithe. Charlotte was harmed many times but miraculously survived. When Ash Smith was eventually caught and convicted for this attack, police found evidence that connected him to an even earlier crime from 1988. The breakthrough that would finally bring justice for Claire came through an unexpected source. While serving time in prison for his other attacks, Ash Smith befriended a fellow prisoner named Paul Dubois. During their conversations, Ash Smith began sharing details about his violent acts, perhaps feeling safe in the environment of criminals around him. He specifically mentioned attacking someone he had seen using a zebra crossing, providing details that would prove crucial to investigators when the case was reopened. This confession, combined with modern forensic techniques and changes in legal procedures that allowed evidence of previous crimes to be presented in court, would finally give prosecutors the tools they needed. In 2010, the Kent Police Cold Case Unit received special funding to re-examine Claire's case using advanced forensic methods that hadn't been available in 1993. The investigation team, led by Detective Superintendent Rob Vinson from the Kent and Essex Serious Crime Directorate Cold Case Team, worked methodically through old evidence and new leads. On the 19th anniversary of Claire's loss, in April 2012, her father Cliff made another public plea for information, still hoping for answers after nearly 2 decades of waiting. The Justice for Claire campaign, formed by her high school friends, organized memorial events, including a candlelit walk in January 2013 that retraced Claire's final steps. These efforts kept pressure on authorities and ensured that Claire's case remained in public consciousness. When Colin Ash Smith was finally arrested and charged with Claire's death, he was already serving 3 life sentences for his attacks on other women. The evidence against him included not only the prison confession, but also details about his distinctive white Ford Capri, which witnesses had seen in the area. Police found that he had given a false alibi for the night of Claire's loss, making a deliberately timed phone call to create the appearance that he was elsewhere. Most damaging were his own detailed writings, which he called plans, documenting his attacks and plotting future violence. The trial took place at Inner London Crown Court in Southwark in late 2014, more than 21 years after Claire lost her life. Prosecutor Brian Altman QC described Ash Smith as a ruthless predatory offender who took pleasure in violence. The Crown's case painted a picture of a man who had planned Claire's loss carefully, choosing her as a vulnerable target. Evidence was presented about Ash Smith's previous convictions, his collection of dangerous objects, and his habit of taking midnight walks, while carrying items capable of causing harm and looking for people to attack. Taking the witness stand in his own defense, Ash Smith admitted to being an animal when describing his previous attacks. He testified about his obsession with women and his hatred toward them, explaining that he feared their power over him. "I didn't like them because I felt they had power over me," he told the court. "My own perception of them was I couldn't trust them because they used me. I felt worthless, low self-esteem, and I had no confidence around other people. I wasn't happy around most people." He admitted to keeping a stash of dangerous objects and writing detailed accounts of his attacks. However, despite these admissions about his other crimes, he insisted that he had not taken Claire's life. The defense team attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's case by suggesting that serial offender Robert Napper, who had taken the lives of multiple women in London during the same time period, might have been responsible for Claire's death. They also tried to discredit the prison confession and argued that there was no direct physical evidence linking Ash Smith to the scene. But the prosecution had built a comprehensive case that included not only the confession, but also the pattern of Ash Smith's behavior, his false alibi, and his access to Claire through their family connection at the British Legion Club. The judge, Mr. Justice Sweeney, made a significant legal decision by allowing evidence of Ash Smith's previous crimes to be presented to the jury. This was one of the earliest high-profile applications of the 2003 Criminal Justice Act's provisions in London, marking an important precedent for future cases. The jurors heard extensive testimony about Ash Smith's 1988 and 1995 convictions and listened to readings from his detailed plans. The evidence painted a clear picture of a man who derived satisfaction from causing serious harm to vulnerable women. After 5 weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury took just 3 hours to reach their verdict. On December 11, 2014, Colin Ash Smith was found guilty of taking Claire Tiltman's life. About a dozen of Claire's school friends were present in the gallery to hear the decision, many breaking down in tears as justice was finally served. Ash Smith stared straight ahead as the verdict was read, showing no visible emotion. The following day, December 12, 2014, Mr. Justice Sweeney delivered the sentence. Ash Smith was given life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. The judge explained that under the old sentencing guidelines, this was roughly equivalent to what he would have received if the case had been prosecuted in 1993. I have no doubt that this was a premeditated act that you carried out because of the feeling of power that it gave you, Justice Sweeney told Ash Smith. In so doing, you not only ended Claire's young life, which was so full of promise, but you also caused unbearable grief and upset to her family and friends. Ash Smith, who was 46 at the time of sentencing, reacted impassively as the life term was imposed. He was not present in court for the sentencing hearing. Justice Sweeney praised the Kent police for their dedication in bringing Claire's case to trial and commended the members of Claire's family and friends who had attended the proceedings. I would also like to commend the members of Claire's family and her friends who have attended this trial for the dignified way in which they have conducted themselves, the judge said, and I express my sorrow for the burden they have had to carry for many years at Claire's untimely loss. Following the conviction, Detective Superintendent Rob Vinson spoke about the impact of the case, describing Ash Smith as an evil and predatory man who had snatched her life away. It should have been a day like any other, he said. Then on that day, Ash Smith has not only taken her life, taken her future as well, and destroyed the lives of her family and friends. Jaswant Nawal, CPS Southeast Chief Crown Prosecutor, called it one of the most complex cases that CPS Southeast had dealt with in recent years. In November 2015, Ash Smith attempted to appeal his conviction, arguing that Justice Sweeney had wrongly allowed gravely prejudicial material to be presented to the jury. However, his appeal was rejected by Lord Justice Davis and 2 other Lords Justice of Appeal, who declared his case unarguable. He remains imprisoned at HMP Durham, serving his sentence for taking Claire's life, along with his previous convictions. Tragically, both Linda and Cliff Tiltman passed away before they could see their daughter's case resolved. They had spent years believing that Colin Ash Smith was responsible for Claire's death, but they never lived to see him held accountable. Their unwavering dedication to seeking justice for their only child kept the case alive in public memory and contributed to the eventual breakthrough that led to the conviction. The loss of these devoted parents, who carried the burden of their grief for over 2 decades, adds another layer of heartbreak to this already devastating story. Claire Tiltman's story represents both the worst of human nature and the best of community resilience. Her life, though cut tragically short, touched countless people who refused to let her memory fade away. The dedication of her friends, the persistence of law enforcement, and the love of her parents ensured that justice eventually prevailed, even though it came far too late for those who loved her most. The case of Carly Gusay. Carly Lane Gusay was born on May 13, 2002, into what would become a fractured family. Her parents, Lindsay Fairley and Zachary Gusay, welcomed her into the world 4 years after their first child, a boy named Cole. The family lived in Bishop, California, but their home wasn't the peaceful sanctuary a young child needed. Lindsay later described how Zach would often drink after work, transforming from a caring father into someone angry and aggressive. He would break things in their home, and once even put his head through the bathroom drywall. The arguments between Lindsay and Zach sometimes became physical, with both admitting to being the aggressor at different times. They both realized their marriage had become toxic, not just for themselves, but for their children. When Carly was still a toddler, her parents made the painful decision to divorce. The separation meant that Carly's childhood would be split between 2 homes, 2 different ways of living. She would spend time with both parents, but the stability every child craves seemed just out of reach. Later, Zachary found love again with a woman named Melissa, who would become Carly's stepmother. Melissa entered their lives when Carly was around 5 years old, and she helped raise both Carly and her older brother Cole as if they were her own children. By October 2018, 16-year-old Carly was living with her father Zachary, now in his early 40s, her stepmother Melissa, and 2 younger half-brothers in a rural area along US Highway 6 in eastern California, about 30 miles from the Nevada border. The Charfant Valley community was small and quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Carly was described as happy and well-liked at school, with no history of serious conflicts beyond typical teenage mishaps. She was a tall, slender girl with long blonde hair and bright blue eyes who stood 57 and weighed around 110 pounds. Those who knew her saw a teenager who seemed to be navigating the normal challenges of adolescence. On Friday evening, October 12, 2018, Carly told Melissa she was planning to attend a high school football game in Bishop. It was a normal teenage weekend activity, the kind of innocent plan that wouldn't raise any concerns. But instead of heading to the football game, Carly met up with her boyfriend Donald Arrowwood III and went to a house party. What happened at that party would set in motion a series of events that no one could have predicted. At the party, Carly, Donald, and another teenager named James Jullin were socializing with friends. During the evening, Carly made a decision that would haunt everyone who loved her. She smoked marijuana, something she hadn't done in quite some time. Donald later explained to investigators that she hadn't smoked in a while. It could have triggered something. Whatever was in the marijuana that night, or perhaps because Carly's system wasn't used to the substance, something went terribly wrong. Carly began to panic in ways that scared everyone around her, including herself. Donald described how she got scared of the music. She got scared of me. The fun evening had turned into something frightening and overwhelming for the teenage girl. Carly's paranoia and fear escalated to the point where she felt unsafe and desperately needed to get home. In her distressed state, she used her iPhone to call her stepmother, Melissa. She was frantic, Melissa later told investigators. She wanted me to pick her up. Without hesitation, Melissa drove out to collect the frightened teenager and brought her home to their rural house in Charfant Valley. It was the kind of rescue that caring parents do, putting aside any disappointment or frustration to help their child in a moment of crisis. But when they arrived home, Carly's ordeal was far from over. The effects of whatever she had consumed continued to torment her throughout the night. Back home, Melissa spent long hours comforting Carly as the troubled teen alternated between moments of lucidity and episodes of paranoia. Carly's birth mother, Lindsay Fairley, who lived in Yerington, Nevada, would later tell investigators that she suspected her daughter had taken LSD rather than just marijuana. Lindsay mentioned that Carly had recently asked her about the substance, and Lindsay had warned her daughter that it was dangerous. Whether it was LSD, marijuana laced with something else, or just a severe reaction, Carly was struggling with frightening thoughts and overwhelming fear. In what she later described as an attempt to create a teaching moment, Melissa made the decision to record 8 minutes of their conversation on her phone. She hoped to replay it for Carly later, when the teenager was sober and could understand the dangers of experimentation. The recording would later become a crucial piece of evidence, but also a source of controversy and suspicion. During the recording, Carly can be heard saying, "I really messed up today," to which Melissa responded with compassion. "We all do things in life that we regret, substances especially." The conversation took darker turns as Carly's paranoia intensified. When Melissa brought her a salad to eat, Carly blurted out, "This is the devil's lettuce." Her mind was creating connections and fears that weren't based in reality. When Melissa urged her stepdaughter to try to get some sleep, Carly's response was heartbreaking and terrifying. "No, I don't want to go to sleep. You're going to hurt me." Melissa tried to reason with the frightened girl, asking, "Why would I hurt you?" That's preposterous. But Carly was trapped in a world of fear and confusion, sobbing as she said, "I'm just thinking all this dark stuff. I can't help it." Throughout the night, Melissa stayed close to Carly, lying beside her on the teenager's bed, trying to provide comfort and reassurance. It was the kind of long, difficult night that tests every parent's patience and love. In the early morning hours of Saturday, October 13, around 5:45 a.m., Melissa briefly woke up and looked over at Carly before falling back asleep. Everything seemed as calm as it could be under the circumstances. When Melissa woke again around 7:15 to 7:30 a.m., her world shattered. Carly was gone. Carly's cell phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, left behind like a discarded piece of her former life. Melissa and Zachary frantically searched their rural neighborhood, calling Carly's name and checking with neighbors. The quiet morning air carried their desperate voices as they realized their worst fears were beginning to unfold. When their search yielded nothing, they made the call that would change everything. They contacted 911 to report Carly missing. That afternoon, the Mono County Sheriff's Office launched what would become an exhaustive search operation. In the days that followed, the search grew to include multiple law enforcement agencies, helicopters, scent dogs, and hundreds of volunteers from the community. Then Sergeant Seth Clark, who later became a lieutenant, described it as a week-long effort involving multiple helicopters, half a dozen scent dogs, and upward of 60 personnel. Rex Hamilton, a neighbor who watched the search unfold, captured the intensity of those days. "This is a quiet little community, but for a few days it was like ground zero up here." The FBI became involved, analyzing cell phone data and pursuing leads wherever they might take the investigation. A week after Carly disappeared, authorities set up a checkpoint along Highway 6, hoping to find someone who might have seen her. About 50 people reported that they had driven through the area on October 13, but heartbreakingly, none recalled seeing anyone matching Carly's description. But there was hope in the form of eyewitness accounts. 3 people came forward to tell investigators they had seen someone matching Carly's description on the morning of October 13. Richard Eddy, a retiree who had previously worked for the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office and lived near the Gusay home, provided crucial testimony. He told investigators that sometime between 6:30 and 6:45 a.m., he saw a tall, slender female with long hair walking by his house, holding a piece of paper in her hand. She was looking up, looking around at the sky, he recalled. Kenneth Dutton, a schoolteacher who lived around the corner from the Gusay family, provided the most definitive identification. He told investigators that he was out in his driveway when he saw Carly walking down the street toward Highway 6, holding a piece of paper. His statement was clear and certain. "I know her. I saw her." A third eyewitness, whose identity has never been publicly revealed, reported seeing someone fitting Carly's description standing in the sagebrush near Highway 6. This location was significant because it was the same area where tracking dogs later lost Carly's scent. The search efforts were extraordinary in their scope and intensity. but they yielded no trace of the missing teenager. Despite helicopters scanning the vast desert landscape, trained dogs following every possible trail, and volunteers combing through difficult terrain, Carly seemed to have simply vanished into the California desert. The lack of any physical evidence, no clothing, no personal items, no footprints beyond what the dogs could track to Highway 6, was both puzzling and heartbreaking for everyone involved. As news of Carly's disappearance spread, it attracted nationwide attention through print media, broadcast news, and social media. The case took on a life of its own online, where armchair detectives and concerned citizens began analyzing every detail. Unfortunately, much of the public attention focused suspiciously on Melissa, Carly's stepmother. Her demeanor in Facebook Live videos that she posted during the search for Carly drew criticism from people who felt she didn't seem genuinely distraught enough. Comments like one from Francie Hartzog of Davidson, North Carolina, who wrote, "One thing that bothers me as a licensed psychotherapist is the stepmother's eyes shift constantly, which indicates lying," began appearing on social media platforms. The situation became even more painful when Carly's birth mother, Lindsay Fairley, publicly began questioning Melissa's credibility and the family's account of what happened. In an October 2018 podcast with Nancy Grace, Lindsay said, "I've been hearing about 4 or 5 stories now, suggesting that the family's version of events was inconsistent." The grief-stricken mother's suspicions grew, and in May 2019, she appeared on the television show Dr. Phil to share her theories about what had happened to her daughter. On the Dr. Phil show, Lindsay made a devastating accusation. "I believe my daughter had a fatal reaction to substances," she said, "and I believe that very early morning, Melissa saw her unresponsive, and I think that's when my daughter passed." The implication was clear. Lindsay believed that Carly had lost her life due to the actions of someone in the house, and that the family had covered it up. These accusations tore through an already grieving family and added another layer of tragedy to an unspeakable situation. In another emotional interview, Lindsay made even more direct accusations against her ex-husband and his wife. Through tears, she said, "I believe there's something dark in Zach and Melissa's house. I just need my little girl home, and I need to know she's okay and she's not being hurt." When given a chance to respond to these allegations, Melissa was clearly devastated. "It's not worth the time," she said, her voice breaking. "It's a lie. It's not worth my time. It's just a complete lie. We've raised Carly since she was like 5. Her older brother since he was like 9. I mean, this is ridiculous. How dare you? Because I'm her stepmom. Because I didn't give birth to her." The public accusations and online speculation created additional anguish for a family already living through every parent's worst nightmare. Melissa defended their efforts to find Carly, pointing out that the FBI has been in our house, the sheriff's office. We've had hundreds and hundreds of people come right into our home and help us. Despite the intense scrutiny and investigation, no evidence was ever found to support the theory that Carly had never left the house. The Mono County Sheriff's Office conducted thorough investigations of the family's claims. They interviewed the 3 eyewitnesses multiple times, searched the Gusay home extensively, and repeatedly questioned both Melissa and Zachary. They analyzed Carly's cell phone and computer, looking for any evidence of wrongdoing. They also verified the cell phone data that corroborated the accounts given by Melissa, Zachary, Donald Arrowood, and James Jullin about the events of October 12 and 13. When asked directly whether she had cleared Carly's family of involvement in her disappearance, Sheriff's Detective Jennifer Braun gave a careful but telling response. "Nobody's been cleared of anything. Right now, we have no evidence to suggest they were involved." As the investigation continued over the months and years, new leads emerged. In March 2021, nearly 3 years after Carly's disappearance, the Mono County Sheriff's Office received an intriguing call. A witness claimed to have seen Carly at a party in Tonopah, Nevada, a historic mining town about 100 miles away from Carly's home in Charfant Valley. Jason Pelichowski, an investigator with the Mono County Sheriff's Office, revealed this development during a recent episode of People magazine Investigates. While he didn't disclose the witness's name or specify exactly when the alleged sighting occurred, he did share that authorities had located a vehicle that may have been used to transport Carly from alongside Highway 6 to Tonopah. Sheriff Ingrid Braun confirmed that the Tonopah lead was being actively investigated by her office in cooperation with the FBI. This development suggested that Carly might have gotten into a vehicle, either voluntarily or under pressure, and been taken far from the search area where hundreds of people had been looking for her. It offered a possible explanation for why such an extensive search of the local area had yielded no trace of the missing teenager. The theories about what happened to Carly have evolved over the years. Initially, many believed she might have walked deep into the desert and lost her life somewhere outside the search zone. Given the harsh environment of the eastern California desert, exposure could be dangerous within hours, especially for someone who wasn't properly prepared and might have been disoriented. However, the exhaustive nature of the search and the fact that no remains had been discovered made this theory seem less likely as time passed. The second major theory was that Carly had gotten into a vehicle and been transporting elsewhere. While statistically unusual, since the majority of missing teenager cases involve runaways rather than abductions, this explanation became more plausible the longer the case remained unsolved. The witness accounts placed Carly walking toward Highway 6, a route that could have put her in the path of passing vehicles. The Tonopah lead seemed to support this theory, suggesting that someone might have picked her up and driven her far from her home. Throughout the investigation, authorities continued to seek public assistance. Gina Swanky, a public affairs officer for the FBI, expressed the ongoing commitment to finding answers. This case is every parent's worst nightmare. Any credible lead is worth following if it will help locate Carly. The FBI established multiple ways for people to share information, including an online tip system and a phone hotline. As the years passed, the case remained active but unsolved. In 2022, on what would have been Carly's 20th birthday, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an age progression image showing what Carly might look like as a young adult. Her father Zachary and stepmother Melissa continued to hold on to hope that she was still alive. "Every day," Zachary said in a recent interview, "we're still searching." The pain of not knowing has been unbearable for everyone who loved Carly. Her disappearance created a hole in multiple families, not just her immediate family, but also extended relatives, friends, classmates, and community members who had watched her grow up. The accusations and suspicions that emerged in the aftermath added another layer of suffering to an already devastating situation. For Carly's younger half-brothers, her disappearance meant growing up without their big sister, wondering if she would ever come home to play games or help with homework. For her older brother Cole, it meant losing the little sister he had watched over and protected. For Lindsay, it meant living with the anguish of not knowing whether her daughter was alive or had lost her life due to the actions of someone else. For Zachary and Melissa, it meant enduring not only the loss of a beloved daughter, but also public suspicion and accusations during the most painful time of their lives. The investigation remains open, with authorities continuing to follow leads and analyze new information as it becomes available. The case has highlighted the challenges law enforcement faces when investigating disappearances in remote, sparsely populated areas where there are few witnesses and vast expanses of difficult terrain to search. It has also demonstrated the double-edged nature of social media attention in missing person cases. While it can help spread awareness and generate tips, it can also create harmful speculation and additional trauma for grieving families. Today, Carly Gusay would be in her early 20s, possibly starting a career, maybe in college, perhaps thinking about her future in ways that 16-year-olds rarely do. Instead, she remains frozen in time as the confused, frightened teenager who walked out of her family's home on that October morning in 2018. Her family continues to hope and search, while investigators continue to follow every credible lead. determined to bring answers to a case that has touched so many hearts. The story of Carly Gusset serves as a heartbreaking reminder of how quickly a young life can be disrupted and how the effects of a single night's decisions can ripple through families and communities for years. Our thoughts remain with Carly, wherever she may be, and with all those who continue to love her and search for answers in this painful mystery that has left too many questions unanswered and too many hearts broken.